Can she even read? The question sliced through the ballroom with the precision of a knife through silk. Laughter followed immediately. Not loud laughter. The worst kind. The kind people use when they want to stay on the right side of power. Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. A violinist near the stage missed a note. Several guests looked down at their plates. Nobody wanted to meet the eyes of the young woman standing beside the table. Ava Johnson heard every word. Of course she did. The ballroom was not large enough to hide a comment like that. High above Manhattan, inside the Grand Meridian Hotel's annual charity gala, nearly 400 guests filled a room decorated with gold accents, white roses, and chandeliers that seemed to float beneath the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Politicians mingled with executives. Investors shared tables with celebrities. Wealth gathered beneath one roof and congratulated itself for being generous. At the center of it all sat Catherine Reynolds. Elegant, wealthy, admired, feared. Her emerald evening gown shimmered beneath the lights. Diamonds sparkled at her neck. Everywhere she turned, people smiled. Not because they necessarily liked her. Because she was married to William Reynolds, one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. Catherine had spent years becoming the kind of person who never expected to be challenged. Tonight was no different. Across from her sat a group of donors discussing literacy programs funded by the charity event. The irony would have been amusing if it were not so uncomfortable. Ava stood beside the table holding a silver tray. 26 years old. Black. Professional. Invisible, at least in the eyes of most guests. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture straight. Her expression calm. She had spent the evening refilling glasses and delivering meals with the kind of quiet competence nobody noticed until it disappeared. Earlier, one donor had asked where a document was located. Ava had pointed toward the correct folder before the event coordinator could answer. Catherine noticed. Interesting, she had said. I assumed staff members just carried trays. A few guests laughed politely. Ava smiled and continued working. Then came the comment that changed everything. Can she even read? Catherine asked while glancing toward a stack of event materials. More laughter. A donor smirked. Another guest shook his head as though the joke had gone too far, but lacked the courage to say so. William Reynolds looked up from his conversation. His expression tightened slightly. Not anger. Discomfort. He had heard the comment too. Ava remained still. Around the table, everyone waited. They expected embarrassment. Maybe an apology. Maybe silence. Catherine leaned back in her chair and accepted another sip of sparkling water. The room moved on. At least it tried to. Yet something about Ava's reaction felt different. She did not look hurt. She did not look angry. She looked thoughtful, as though Catherine had accidentally presented her with a puzzle. Near the stage, a volunteer hurried toward the table carrying a thick folder containing several pages of donor agreements, sponsorship records, and event schedules. The volunteer placed the folder down beside Catherine. Catherine glanced at it and laughed lightly. Maybe we should test her. Several guests chuckled. William looked away. Ava's eyes moved briefly toward the folder, then back toward Catherine. The violinist resumed playing. Conversations restarted. The gala continued. Yet beneath the music and laughter, something had quietly changed. Because Catherine Reynolds believed she had just ended a story. In reality, she had only begun one. The folder remained on the table like a challenge waiting to be accepted. Catherine Reynolds glanced at it, and then toward Ava Johnson. A smile touched her lips. It was the kind of smile people wore when they believed the outcome had already been decided. Around the table, several donors leaned back in their chairs, sensing entertainment. Charity galas often followed predictable patterns. Speeches, auctions, networking. Tonight, apparently, there would also be a public lesson. Ava continued holding her tray. She had worked enough events to recognize when powerful people became bored. Bored people often looked for someone weaker than themselves to turn into a joke. Catherine tapped a manicured finger against the thick folder. Ava, would you do me a favor? Her tone sounded pleasant enough. That made it worse. Several guests immediately became interested. William Reynolds looked up from his conversation again. The discomfort on his face deepened slightly. He knew his wife well. He knew that voice. Ava nodded politely. Of course, ma'am. Catherine opened the folder and removed a packet of sponsorship agreements. Dozens of pages. Dense text. Legal language. Financial commitments. Donor conditions. The sort of documents most people avoided reading unless they absolutely had to. Catherine held up one page. I was trying to find a particular clause. A few guests exchanged knowing smiles. The trap was becoming obvious. Perhaps you could help. The violinist continued playing softly near the stage. Yet, even through the music, the tension around the table became impossible to miss. Nearby conversations slowed. Several guests pretended to focus on dinner while listening carefully. Ava remained calm. What clause are you looking for? Catherine laughed lightly. Well, that depends. She handed over the page. Can you tell me what this says? A donor nearly choked on his drink. Another looked away, embarrassed on Ava's behalf. The room understood exactly what was happening. Catherine was not searching for information. She was testing someone she had already decided was incapable. Ava accepted the document. The paper felt heavy beneath her fingers, not because of its weight, because of the assumptions attached to it. She lowered her eyes and began reading silently. The ballroom carried on around her. Glasses clinked. Silverware touched porcelain. Yet at this table, time seemed to slow. Catherine watched closely. So did everyone else. A few seconds passed. Then a minute. Ava's expression never changed. She simply read. The confidence on Catherine's face grew. She expected hesitation, confusion, a request for help. Instead, Ava turned the page. Then another. William noticed that immediately. Most people struggling with a document do not continue reading deeper into it. Ava did. The billionaire leaned forward slightly. Across the table, one of the attorneys attending the gala narrowed his eyes. Something about the scene no longer felt amusing. It felt important. Ava reached the final page and looked up. Her expression remained thoughtful. Not nervous. Thoughtful. Catherine folded her arms. Well, she asked. The question floated across the table. Around them, the ballroom seemed to lean closer. Ava glanced once more at the document. Then she looked directly at Catherine Reynolds. And for the first time that evening, several people realized that the young waitress was not trying to survive the test. She was evaluating it. Ava Johnson lowered the document slightly and looked across the table. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Catherine Reynolds sat with the confidence of someone expecting a performance to end exactly as planned. Around her, donors watched with varying degrees of anticipation and discomfort. Some appeared entertained. Others looked embarrassed. A few wished they were sitting somewhere else entirely. William Reynolds remained silent. Yet unlike everyone else, he was not watching his wife. He was watching Ava. Something about the young waitress's expression had caught his attention. She did not look intimidated. She looked focused. Ava glanced back at the page. The legal language was dense, but familiar. Sponsorship agreements. Donation obligations. Event compliance requirements. The sort of documents she had spent years studying before life changed direction. Several guests assumed she was searching for a sentence she could understand. In reality, she was verifying something. The difference mattered. Catherine finally broke the silence. Well, she repeated. A faint smile remained on her face. Ava nodded politely. You said you were looking for a clause. Catherine leaned back. Correct. Ava placed a finger on the second page. Section 14. The smile on Catherine's face flickered. Barely. Excuse me. Ava lifted the document slightly. Section 14. The donor liability clause. Several people at the table exchanged glances. One attorney attending the gala immediately sat up straighter. Ava continued calmly. It outlined sponsorship obligations in the event of financial withdrawal after public commitment. The attorney's eyes widened. Catherine blinked once. The room grew noticeably quieter. Ava turned another page. There is also a revised amendment attached to the agreement. Now even the attorney looked surprised. What amendment? He asked before he could stop himself. Ava showed him the page. This one. The attorney leaned forward and examined the document. After a few seconds, he slowly nodded. She is right. The words landed heavily. Nearby conversations faded. A donor who had been reaching for his wine glass stopped halfway. Another guest lowered her fork onto her plate without taking a bite. The violinist continued playing, but the music now felt distant. Catherine's confidence began slipping beneath the weight of uncertainty. You memorized that from a quick glance? She asked. Ava shook her head. No. She paused. I read it. More silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Astonished silence. The kind that appears when a room suddenly realizes it has misunderstood someone completely. William Reynolds folded his hands together and studied Ava more carefully. Across the table, the attorney requested the document. Ava handed it to him. He reviewed several pages before looking up. Everything she said is accurate. That changed everything. The issue was no longer whether Ava could read. The issue was how someone had underestimated her so badly. Catherine looked around the table. The laughter from earlier had disappeared. Nobody was smiling now. Not because they felt sorry for Ava, because they were questioning their own assumptions. Ava remained standing with the same calm posture she had maintained all evening. No anger, no triumph, no attempt to embarrass anyone in return. She simply answered the question she had been given. Yet somehow that made the moment even more powerful. Because she did not defeat the insult with outrage. She defeated it with competence. And as the realization spread through the ballroom, more and more people began turning toward the young waitress. Not to judge her, to understand who she really was. The atmosphere around the table changed so completely that several guests seemed unsure how to behave. Just minutes earlier, Ava Johnson had been little more than part of the scenery. Another server moving between tables beneath crystal chandeliers. Another uniform among many. Now people looked at her differently. Not because she had raised her voice. Not because she had demanded respect. Because she had quietly demonstrated something they never expected. Competence. The attorney continued reviewing the sponsorship agreement. Every few pages he nodded slightly, confirming yet another detail Ava had identified correctly. Around the table, donors exchanged uncomfortable glances. The discomfort had nothing to do with Ava. It had everything to do with themselves. People rarely enjoy discovering how wrong their first impression was. Catherine Reynolds felt the shift immediately. She had spent years mastering social rooms like this one. She understood power. She understood status. Most importantly, she understood how quickly public opinion could move. The room was no longer laughing with her. The room was watching her. William Reynolds noticed it too. He sat quietly, studying both women. The billionaire had attended thousands of meetings during his career. He had negotiated mergers worth billions of dollars. Yet some of the most revealing moments he had ever witnessed involved neither money nor contracts. They involved character. And tonight, character was on display. Nearby, the master of ceremonies continued speaking about literacy initiatives funded by the charity. The timing felt almost surreal. Large screens displayed statistics about education access and reading programs for underserved communities. Beneath those screens, a young waitress had just been forced to prove she could read by people supporting literacy charities. The irony was impossible to ignore. Ava handed the document back to Catherine. "The clause you were looking for is on page 14, she said politely. "The amendment begins on page 22. Catherine accepted the folder. For a brief moment, she seemed uncertain what to say. It was not a feeling she experienced often. One donor attempted to rescue the conversation. "You mentioned sponsorship obligations. How did you recognize the language so quickly?" Ava hesitated. She never enjoyed talking about herself. Yet dozens of eyes now waited for an answer. "I used to study similar documents." Several guests leaned forward. "Used to?" asked the attorney. Ava nodded. "Before I left school." The answer created even more questions. The attorney closed the folder completely. "What were you studying?" Silence settled over the table once again. Ava glanced toward the ballroom, where other servers continued working. For a second, she looked as though she might simply walk away. Then she answered, "Law." The word hit the table harder than anyone expected. A donor lowered his wine glass. Another guest blinked repeatedly. Even the attorney looked surprised. Catherine stared at her. "Law school?" Ava nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Nobody laughed this time. The laughter belonged to an earlier version of the evening. A version that no longer existed. William Reynolds leaned back slowly. Suddenly, several pieces of the puzzle fit together. The confidence. The attention to detail. The way Ava read the document. None of it was accidental. Across the ballroom, the violinist transitioned into a softer melody. The charity gala continued moving forward. Yet at this particular table, a different story had begun. The question was no longer whether Ava could read. The question had become far more interesting. Why was someone capable of doing all this standing here carrying a serving tray instead of sitting at the table herself? The question lingered above the table like a spotlight. Why was someone who had studied law serving dinner at a charity gala? Around them, conversations from neighboring tables faded into the background. Even guests who had nothing to do with the exchange found themselves listening. Ava Johnson could feel the attention gathering again, and she disliked every second of it. Attention had a way of turning people into stories before anyone bothered to learn the facts. She adjusted her grip on the serving tray and offered a small smile. Life happened, she said. A few guests laughed softly, but nobody looked satisfied with the answer. William Reynolds leaned forward. That sounds like a very short version. Ava nodded. It is. The billionaire studied her for a moment. There was no judgment in his expression, only curiosity. Across the table, Catherine Reynolds remained unusually quiet. Earlier in the evening, she had controlled every conversation without effort. Now she seemed unsure where to place herself inside this one. The shift had not gone unnoticed. Several donors glanced toward her before returning their attention to Ava. The attorney who had reviewed the document closed his folder and spoke carefully. You were in law school and left? Ava nodded. During my third year. A few people exchanged surprised looks. Third year meant she had been close to finishing. Why? Asked one donor. Ava hesitated. She rarely discussed that chapter of her life. Not because she was ashamed of it, because it belonged to her family, and some stories felt too personal for rooms full of strangers. Yet something about the evening had already crossed that boundary. My mother became sick, she said quietly. The table fell silent again. Not the dramatic silence from before. A different kind. A human one. Ava continued. Someone needed to help. No long speech followed. No detailed explanation. She did not need one. Most people understood immediately. Plans change. Responsibilities arrive. Dreams wait. Around the ballroom, the charity event continued. Waiters moved between tables. Auction bids appeared on large screens. A speaker discussed education programs from the stage. Yet at this table, nobody seemed interested in any of it. William looked down briefly before meeting Ava's eyes again. And you never went back? Ava smiled faintly. Not yet. The word yet caught several people by surprise. It carried possibility instead of regret. Across the table, Catherine finally spoke. You make it sound simple. Ava considered that. It was not simple. The honesty in her answer settled heavily over the group. But difficult things do not stop being necessary just because they are difficult. The attorney slowly nodded. One investor looked away, suddenly thoughtful. Another guest stared into her wine glass. Everyone seemed to be measuring Ava against the assumptions they had made earlier in the evening. None of those assumptions were surviving the comparison. Near the stage, applause erupted for a successful auction item. The sound briefly filled the ballroom before fading again. William glanced toward the stage, then back at Ava. You know, he said, most people spend a great deal of energy trying to appear impressive. Ava laughed softly. That sounds exhausting. Several guests smiled. Even Catherine could not hide a small reaction. For the first time all evening, the tension around the table eased. Yet something important had changed. The guests no longer saw a waitress carrying a tray. They saw a woman who had sacrificed a future she earned in order to protect someone she loved. And suddenly, the document she read so easily was no longer the most impressive thing about her. The conversation should have ended there. In most rooms, it would have. A brief moment of admiration, a few polite compliments, and then everyone would return to discussing themselves. Yet something about Ava Johnson continued pulling attention toward her. Perhaps it was the contrast. The young woman carrying a serving tray possessed the kind of discipline and intelligence people expected to find behind executive desks. Or perhaps it was the way she spoke about sacrifice without asking for sympathy. Either way, the atmosphere around the table had changed completely. The same guests who had laughed earlier now listened carefully whenever she spoke. Across the ballroom, auction results flashed across giant screens. A speaker thanked donors for their generosity. Glasses clinked. Applause rose and fell. The charity gala continued moving forward. Yet at William Reynolds's table, another story had quietly become far more interesting. Ava excused herself and returned to work. She preferred motion to attention. Motion gave her something practical to focus on. Attention demanded explanations. As she moved between tables, however, she could feel eyes following her. Not judgmental eyes. Curious ones. The shift felt strange. A few hours ago, most people barely noticed her existence. Now they seemed eager to know everything. Near the stage, a volunteer approached carrying a clipboard. Excuse me, he said. One of the scholarship sponsors has a question about the program documents. Could you help me find a section? Ava smiled politely. I can try. The volunteer handed her the packet. Ava scanned several pages and pointed toward the correct section almost immediately. The volunteer thanked her and hurried away. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet several nearby guests witnessed it. One donor laughed quietly. There she goes again. Another shook his head in disbelief. How does she do that? Back at the table, Catherine Reynolds heard the comment. She looked toward Ava. For the first time all evening, she seemed genuinely uncertain. Not about the documents. About herself. Because every new detail about Ava challenged a conclusion Catherine had reached within seconds of meeting her. That realization is rarely comfortable. William noticed his wife's expression. He had known Catherine for 20 years. He understood when she was irritated. He understood when she was confident. This was neither. This looked suspiciously like reflection. Meanwhile, the attorney who had spoken with Ava earlier remained deep in thought. Finally, he looked toward William. Do you know what impresses me most? William shook his head. The attorney nodded toward Ava. She never once tried to prove anyone wrong. The observation settled heavily over the table. Because it was true. Ava had not corrected Catherine out of anger. She had not used her education to embarrass anyone. She simply answered questions when asked. That difference mattered. A great deal. Across the ballroom, Ava stopped briefly beside a window overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Thousands of lights. Thousands of stories. For a moment she allowed herself a quiet breath. Then she turned and continued working. The gala still needed servers. The guests still needed assistance. Life, as always, moved forward. Yet without realizing it, Ava had already changed the room. Not through status. Not through money. Not through power. She had changed it by revealing something many people had forgotten. Intelligence is easy to admire when it wears a suit. Character is recognizing it when it wears an apron. As the evening moved closer to its conclusion, the atmosphere inside the Grand Meridian Hotel felt noticeably different from the one that had existed only a few hours earlier. The charity gala still sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Donors still discussed philanthropy. Photographers still moved through the ballroom, capturing carefully composed moments. Yet beneath the elegance, something fundamental had shifted. Ava Johnson had become impossible to ignore. Not because she demanded attention, because she had earned respect. Near the center of the ballroom, William Reynolds stood speaking with several board members about the literacy initiative the gala supported. The irony of the evening had not escaped him. A room full of people raising money for education had nearly dismissed one of the most educated people present simply because she wore a server's uniform. The thought lingered in his mind. Across the room, Ava continued helping guests with the same professionalism she had shown since the beginning of the night. She never slowed down, never changed her attitude, never treated anyone differently because the room now viewed her differently. That consistency impressed William more than any academic achievement. Nearby, Catherine Reynolds sat quietly at her table. Several guests attempted to resume normal conversation, but she seemed distracted. Every so often her eyes drifted toward Ava. Not with resentment, not even with embarrassment, more with the uncomfortable realization that certainty can sometimes become blindness. For years, Catherine had trusted first impressions. Wealth signaled success. Titles signaled intelligence. Status signaled importance. The evening had exposed the flaws in that equation. Meanwhile, a representative from one of the literacy foundations approached William carrying several program proposals. Would you like to review the scholarship recommendations before the auction closes? The representative asked. William accepted the folder and opened it casually. After a few moments, his expression changed. There is a discrepancy here. The representative frowned. What kind? William pointed toward a section of the report. The scholarship totals listed in one column did not match the calculations presented later in the document. It was not a major issue, just an error, but an important one. The representative looked concerned. I did not notice that. William glanced across the ballroom. Then he smiled slightly. I know someone who might. Several minutes later, Ava found herself standing beside the table again. The representative explained the problem and handed her the document. Around them, several guests immediately became interested. Word had spread quickly throughout the ballroom. People had begun trusting Ava's judgment. She reviewed the pages carefully. Then she pointed toward a line item buried deep within the proposal. The Scholarship Renewal Fund was counted twice. The representative checked the numbers. After a moment, he laughed in disbelief. That is exactly what happened. Nearby guests shook their heads and smiled. Not because the mistake was dramatic. Because Ava found it so quickly. William thanked her. The representative thanked her. Even several board members thanked her. Through it all, Ava remained modest. To her, reading carefully was not remarkable. It was simply what responsible people did. And as applause rose once again for another successful donation announcement, more and more guests realized that the most valuable contribution made that evening had not come from a billionaire's checkbook. It had come from a waitress who refused to stop paying attention. As the final auction items approached the stage, the story spreading through the ballroom had little to do with donations anymore. People still applauded winning bids. They still raised paddles and smiled for photographs. Yet conversations kept returning to the same person, the waitress. The woman who had read legal agreements more carefully than attorneys. The woman who had spotted mistakes hidden inside scholarship proposals. The woman Catherine Reynolds had dismissed before learning a single fact about her. Ava Johnson was carrying a tray of coffee cups when she noticed several guests looking her way again. The attention felt strange. She had spent years learning how to move through rooms unnoticed. Now the room seemed determined to notice her. Near the stage, William Reynolds was speaking with members of the foundation board. Every few minutes someone pointed discreetly toward Ava. Every time it happened, she wished they would stop. She had not come to the gala to impress anyone. She had come to work. Yet the evening had developed a momentum of its own. Across the ballroom, Catherine sat quietly beside a table decorated with white roses and crystal centerpieces. Earlier, she had been the loudest voice in the room. Now she seemed lost in thought. Several guests approached her with polite conversation, but she appeared distracted. The confidence remained. The elegance remained. Yet something else had appeared beside them. Reflection. William eventually crossed the ballroom and stopped near her table. "You have been quiet," he said. Catherine gave a faint smile. "That is unusual, is it not?" William laughed softly. "A little." For a moment neither spoke. Then Catherine looked toward Ava. "I was certain about her." William followed her gaze. Ava was helping an elderly donor find a misplaced program booklet. "Most of us were certain," he said. Catherine nodded slowly. "That is the problem." The admission surprised even her. Nearby, a few guests overheard the exchange. Nobody interrupted. Some lessons arrived too honestly for interruption. At that same moment, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage to announce the largest donation of the evening. Applause swept through the ballroom. Cameras flashed. The charity's mission appeared on giant screens hanging above the audience. Words about opportunity, education, potential. William read them carefully. Then he smiled to himself, because the entire evening had become an example of those very ideas. Opportunity often hides where people fail to look. Potential rarely announces itself. Education does not always wear expensive clothes. After the applause faded, Catherine stood from her chair. Several guests immediately noticed. She walked across the ballroom with measured steps. Conversations softened. Ava looked up as Catherine approached. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Not with fear this time. With curiosity. Catherine stopped beside her. For a second, neither woman spoke. Then Catherine glanced toward the document folder still resting on a nearby table. "You know," she said quietly, "I spent the entire evening assuming I understood who you were." Ava remained calm. People do that sometimes. A small smile appeared on Catherine's face. Not proud. Not defensive. Human. "Yes," she replied. "And sometimes people are very wrong." Around them, the ballroom continued glowing beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet in that moment, the most important thing in the room was not the money being raised. It was the willingness of one person to reconsider a judgment and the grace of another person who never demanded an apology to begin with. By the time the final guests began gathering their coats, the ballroom felt calmer than it had all evening. The auction had ended. The speeches were finished. The giant donation total glowed above the stage, while volunteers celebrated another successful year for the foundation. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the room, but the energy had changed. Earlier, people had arrived eager to be seen. Now many were leaving thoughtful. Some carried business cards. Others carried photographs from the event. A surprising number carried a story about a waitress. Ava Johnson moved quietly through the ballroom collecting empty glasses and folded programs. She worked with the same focus she had shown from the beginning. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had become the most memorable person at the gala. To her, the night was still a shift. There were tables to clear and responsibilities to finish before she could go home. Across the room, William Reynolds stood near the stage speaking with board members. Several donors stopped to thank him for the event. Yet more than one conversation drifted back to Ava. The Literacy Foundation director smiled as she listened. "Funny," she said. "We spent the entire evening raising money for education." William nodded. "We did." The director glanced toward Ava. "And somehow the best lesson came from someone not standing on the stage." William followed her gaze and smiled. Because she was right. Not long afterward, Catherine Reynolds approached Ava one final time. The ballroom had emptied enough that nobody was paying much attention anymore. The audience was gone. The pressure was gone. Only honesty remained. Catherine looked around at the nearly empty room before speaking. "I owe you something." Ava shook her head gently. "You do not owe me anything." Catherine smiled faintly. "That is kind of you." She paused. "But I was wrong." The words came quietly. No dramatic speech. No grand apology. Just a simple acknowledgement. Ava studied her for a moment. Then she nodded. "We all get things wrong sometimes." Catherine laughed softly. "You are making this easier than I deserve." Ava's expression remained calm. Holding on to anger takes too much energy. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Catherine extended her hand. Ava accepted it. The gesture lasted only seconds. Yet it carried more weight than any auction bid placed that evening. Nearby, William watched the exchange. Not because he wanted to interfere. Because he understood its significance. Respect had finally replaced assumption. As the last guests departed, staff members began dimming sections of the ballroom. Chairs were stacked. Floral arrangements were carefully removed. The city beyond the windows sparkled beneath the Manhattan skyline. Another gala was ending. Another charity event would soon become a memory. Yet some memories remain longer than others. Years later, few people would remember the exact amount raised that evening. They would forget who won most of the auction items. They would forget the speeches and the menus and the seating arrangements. But they would remember the moment a waitress was called illiterate and answered not with anger, not with humiliation, but with knowledge, patience, and dignity. Because the truth that silenced the room had nothing to do with reading a document. It was something much larger. People saw a uniform and assumed they understood a person. Ava showed them how wrong that assumption could be. She never raised her voice. She never demanded respect. She simply revealed who she already was. And in the end, that was more powerful than anything money could buy.